Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Blood Feud and Civilization reduced to the level of Anglo-Saxons. A demographic political portrait of the Anglo-Saxon ethnicity in 1086 should be hung in the most prestigious museums of science, for here one can discern what may be the most influential evolutionary ancestor of modern political reductionism. This was the year of the Doomsday Book, the famous survey of the assets of England. By confirming the conquest reduction of the Anglo-Saxon ethnicity to a sub-political body, that precocious record also documented evidence for an evolutionary explanation of the modern democratic belief that the political can be legitimately reduced to the sub-political. The Enlightenment-era belief in scientific reductionism was connected to a new political science. The moderns assumed that political order could be legitimately reduced to its individual component parts and reconstituted from the ground up on this democratic basis. Soundness of modern scientific reductionism, as applied to politics, was countered by Herder in Germany. In France, Rousseau's attacks on the modern bourgeois debasement of the human helped inspire the French Revolution. The neo-Norman aristocracy of the American South chose civil war to the prospect of being reduced to the level of Anglo-Saxons. Nietzsche put his finger on the connection between modern scientific reductionism and modern democratic, slave morality. That science cannot be simply and unequivocally identified with reductionism is illustrated by methodology of the so-called father of scientific history, 1150 Otto Ranke. The whole, totale, is as certain as is its every outward expression. At every moment we must dedicate our full attention to it. If we are studying a people, we are not interested in all the individual details through which it expresses itself as a living thing. Rather, its idea speaks to us through its development as a whole, its deeds, its institutions, its literature. 1151. This is yet another example of the more Gestalt assumptions of the German scientific tradition. The normative scientific reflex of the English-speaking world is to assume that, insofar as the existence of the whole is posited, it is unscientific. Yet this raises a question. Can unanalyzed reductionism comprehend the German difference from the English-speaking world if the root of this difference is the ethnocentric projection of a differential historical experience? A classic illustration of this difference is embodied by Hegel. Could Hegel have been other than a German? Is it possible to imagine Hegel as an Englishman? In contrast to many internationally minded political philosophies, it was significant within Hegel's historical philosophy that he was a German, a Swabian in Prussia at the time that Napoleon claimed victory against Prussia at Jena. While Hegel has had followers in the English-speaking world, the general consensus has been that freedom and right so construed are largely alien to Anglo-Saxon conceptions of freedom and right. Hegel demonstrated that a state integrated with a constitutional monarchy could be conceived in compatibility with modern, rational institutions through a very different path of reasoning. The example of Hegel refutes the idea that Anglo-Saxon hostility to the German model is due solely to the superior development of rational, parliamentary institution. England, leaving the Anglo-Americans to explain why their state is the way it is on other grounds. In Walter Kaufmann's major reinterpretation of Hegel's work, he noted that while self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein, can mean being embarrassed or unsure of oneself in English, in German it means the opposite, being self-assured or proud. 1152. If the self is not automatically assumed to be reduced to only an individual organism, but expanded towards a socio-biological superorganism, then perhaps a clue to this German difference can be uncovered. The association of self-consciousness with self-effacement in English suggests a lack of ethnic self-consciousness, which further suggests a lack of Anglo-Saxon self-awareness. But is this lack of national self-awareness universal? Shortly after the First World War, the German cultural historian Müller van den Broek wrote, "Prussianism represents the political will of the German people." The strength of Prussianism has always been and still is the strength to bring together and unite all Germans who today struggle for unity are Prussians. Hegel, originally from the German province of Swabia, completed his greatest philosophical works as a Prussian. The unity of knowledge, represented institutionally by the university, was the aspiration of philosophy as embodied by Hegel. Unity of all knowledge through an attempt at philosophical completeness implies the incorporation of self-knowledge, self-awareness, and self-consciousness. Hegel picked up where Anglo-Saxon political thought leaves off, whereas the more normative Anglo-Saxon philosophy of anti-philosophy sweeps all loose philosophical ends under the carpet of individual freedom. Hegel attempted to unite the state, history, and all the essential milestones of the human mind into a comprehensive philosophy. The Anglo-Saxon metaphysics of freedom, by contrast, has provided a pragmatic means of evading irrational, scientific self-accounting. The German proclivity towards the completeness of philosophical systems is related to the historic completeness of their socio-biological systems. The comprehensive socio-biological Überorganism development of the Germans appears to Anglo-American empiricism as a greater distortion of reality, especially in the form of myths or idealism. Yet the socio-biological basis of this subjectivity is a stronger correlation between German sociology and German biology on the highest levels. The German tendency to exceed the Anglo-Saxons in the aspiration to assimilate the philosophical whole has been rooted in the coherence of the German socio-biological whole. Whereas the German way implies a continuous differentiation within a whole, the Anglo-Saxon emphasis on analysis implies discontinuous differentiation and a weaker projection of wholeness at large. The predominance of Anglo-Saxon socio-biological discontinuity over continuity is correlated with the predominance of symbolization over incorporation. Differentiation may be the most German way of analysis. Differentiation, whether in an individual or a social organism, implies analytic distinctions, overarching hierarchical unity. Instead of leaving analytic distinctions isolated from one another, discriminations within mental and social order are commonly coordinated. The constraints of socio-biological context, Gleichschaltung, within the overarching hierarchical unity of the German Überorganism. Differentiations of kin, kind, and king can be made internally and projected externally upon the outside world. In other words, unity is not equality, and within the unity of the German nation, differentiations of sex, character, and ability are made within that unity. The classic Norman way of making discriminations within discriminations revolved around assumptions of class that implied presumptions of caste. At its most extreme, the Norman aristocracy imposed artificial classifications of predetermined castes and called this civilization. Products of the Norman social classification view include the English class system, British India, and the American slave South. The difference between Norman social classification and German holistic differentiation is the difference between the English class system and German nationalism. Norman classification, originally formalized in Magna Carta, is either unbounded by a higher unifying principle, the slave South in the Civil War, or weakly bounded by a higher unifying principle, i.e. the king. It was partly because Norman social classification was perceived as artificial civilization that the Anglo-Saxon rejected the weak basis of unity altogether and attempted to organize on the basis of democratic individuation. German national differentiation, Norman social classification, and Anglo-Saxon democratic individuation are three theories of everything, three bases for chopping up and perceiving the world. Anglo-Saxon democratic individuation is a reaction against the Norman social classification's inability to constitute a political unity on the level of German national differentiation. 1066 thus began the path from Hobbes to Hobbes, from a nation reduced to sub-political body to a sub-political body that continued its disintegration into modern, Hobbesian individuals. In 1066, a generation of Anglo-Saxon leaders failed their country. That generation of leaders failed the whole, and consequently, the Anglo-Saxon sense of socio-biological wholeness failed. The conquest shattered kinship cultural unity, and the Anglo-Saxons were never able to fully overcome the sense of wholeness lost in that downgrading. The Normans reduced the Anglo-Saxons from a potential whole to a definitive part. The Norman way of social classification never lost the impression of being partly foreign to the native whole. Totalitarian politics is a foreign concept to the modern English-speaking world, in part because part of England's socio-biological total was felt to be residually foreign. The idea of the whole is really just a thorough treatment of the idea of generalization. Generally speaking, both the German tendency to generalize and the modern English-speaking world's tendency to resist generalizations both project political assumptions towards metaphysical assumptions. The Anglo-Saxon metaphysics of freedom, for example, projects a metaphysical conquest of the idea that the Norman conquest permanently enslaved the Anglo-Saxon race, whereas traditional German self-acceptance of generalizations about themselves led them to project generalizations about other people. Anglo-Saxon resistance to generalizing about themselves overgeneralized their own resistance to a wholehearted identification with government order, i.e. American universalism. The basic Anglo-Saxon of rebutting generalizations is to expose them to a more analytic exposure to reality, empiricism. This contrasts starkly with German idealism's assumption of the coherence of an internal order, like an internal connection between kin and king. Anglo-empiricism suggests an incoherence of internal order, like the liberal assumption that there is no connection between kin and king, and finds its way in the world through empirical openness to external order. Whereas German differentiation makes analytic distinction within an overarching unity, the conquest shattering of any sense of unity gutted the vivisected Anglo-Saxon mind outward so that analytic differentiations became expressed externally rather than internally. What is striking about English thinkers is just how tenuous and superficial they perceive social bonds to be. Government and men are held together only by self-interested contracts. While the conquest reduced the Anglo-Saxons to sub-political parts, modernity is marked by turning this analytic reductionistic condition against the Normans themselves as a weapon to bring the conquerors down with. Anglo-analytic philosophy originated in an active resistance to false political assumptions, such as the belief in a hereditary connection between the Norman government and the Anglo-Saxon people. Freedom from unjustified beliefs demanded a critique of false first principles of political philosophy, i.e. the right of conquest. After Hobbes, this modern approach became especially opposed to the convergence of assumptions that leads to the idealization of the political as the highest synthesis of the human, i.e. William the Conqueror as a model of human greatness, whereas German philosophy is characterized by the will to synthesize all knowledge. Philosophy in the English-speaking world is characterized by the will to analyze all knowledge. Yet a rigorous analysis of the origins of this characteristically modern proclivity towards analysis reveals a desire to analyze or separate the influence of the Norman conquest from modern times. In other words, Anglo-American modernity itself is partly a product of a desire to separate, isolate, and compartmentalize the influence of the Norman conquest into the category of medieval times, and this itself helped give birth to the conceptual break from the past that characterizes modern times. While the Normans themselves often despised England before 1066 as the Dark Ages, modernity in the English-speaking world can almost be defined by an effort to repress the historical influence of the Norman conquest and despise that era as the Dark Ages. This suggests that the demonstrable tendency towards analysis in English-speaking political philosophy evolved from an inability to mentally digest or synthesize elements of their own past into their modern identity. The relative failure of the Anglo-Saxons in philosophy, in comparison with the Germans, is correlated with an inability to incorporate themselves and self-knowledge on a higher level, i.e. like an uber-organismic level. Anglo-American analytic philosophy's strong, anti-philosophical tendency to isolate philosophy as a domain separate from the rest of life evolved from the tendency to separate the highest general principles of political life, which, at root, would lead to generalizing about the conquest from the real life of the conquered. Put another way, Anti-Normanism is the source of a primal gap in the totality of the English-speaking world's modern self-comprehension. The eruption of resentment of the Norman yoke in the 17th century was rediscovered by English historian Christopher Hill. Where it is most open to criticism, he wrote, is that it never arrived at a conception of history which sees society as a whole. 1154. This is really another way of saying that the hostility to the Norman yoke, rationalized as Anglo-Saxon resistance to powerful government, was inordinately ethnocentric. Here, at a primal origin of modernity, one can discern an origin of a fundamental difference from ancient political assumptions: the modern belief that there is no legitimate political whole or common good. The Norman-Saxon conflict thus clarifies how the Anglo-Saxons lost the German sense of the inclusive political whole. The authentic kid whole became a partial, majoritarian perspective among the Anglo-Saxons, while the de facto political whole became partial or biased through the domination of its ruling Norman part. The Norman dilemma catalyzed a reductionistic Enlightenment methodology wherein each individual is democratically counted, but is not assumed to add up to larger unmediated whole. The Anglo-Saxons cured themselves of the Normans with individualism and a myopic, steadfast devotion to the proposition that no such thing as a forest exists, only trees. Reductionism, in other words, provided a means to overlook the overlords. There is at least some truth in the notion that German philosophy demonstrates proclivities similar to Nazi totalitarianism. Yet Anglo-Saxon resistance to political totalitarianism in no way demonstrates the most total Enlightenment aspiration to philosophic knowledge. Just as German totalitarianism had an essential anti-rationalist basis connected with German Völkisch pride, Anglo-Saxon anti-totalitarianism also seems to have a comparable anti-rationalist basis. Here one can see, once again, similarities at the root of differences. The same self-conscious pride at the root of German totalitarianism of the Hegelian variety is also at the root of Anglo-Saxon anti-totalitarianism. This suggests that Anglo-Saxons do not want to understand the influence of the Norman conquest upon themselves in systematic resistance to political totalitarianism is, in part, connected to a certain kind of anti-philosophical anti-intellectualism. This resistance to total understanding stifles a rational comprehension of 1066's relation to modernity. It is a dark, blind spot of the so-called Enlightenment. Facing the foundational issues in a way characteristic of the Germans would lead the Anglo-Saxons to the basic issue of their failure to avert the conquest and all its consequences. For example, when the conquest itself is accepted in a traditional or mindless way, then Englishmen can argue whether Normans or Saxons should take greater credit for precocious achievements of English history such as the Doomsday Book. The issue, in other words, becomes who was responsible for the Doomsday Book instead of bringing attention to the fact that the Doomsday was only necessary in the first place because the Norman were foreigners ignorant of the specific contents of their newly won kingdom. If Doomsday was a means of achieving the maximal exploitation of the spoils of Anglo-Saxons, is this something that Anglo-Saxons should proudly take credit? German striving towards the roots of problems was directly related to the integrity of their contact with their own roots. Nietzsche and the Nazis, for example, could more easily identify the foreign roots of Jewish Christianity because they were closer to their own pagan roots. The Norman conquest, by contrast, set in motion a complex internal evolution that ruptured the English-speaking world's connection with its most primal roots. The Anglo-Saxon penchant for reductionism skepticism in philosophy stems, in part, from political reduction by Norman political authorities. Traditional Anglo-Saxon skepticism towards grand generalizations is, at least in part, ethnocentrically rooted in resistance to Norman French pretensions to the highest philosophic truths. The supposedly empirical Anglo-Saxon tradition neglects an empirical account of the influence of the conquest political reduction on modern political reductionism. The conquest political reduction of Anglo-Saxons to Anglo-Saxons was the ancestor of the modern reduction of the birthrights of Englishmen to the rights of man. This is how the Anglo-Saxons became a race of individuals. This variety of modern political reductionism was both descriptive and prescriptive in being reduced themselves. Their ability to overcome and regenerate their historic loss was itself reduced. The new individual egalitarian justice could not fully equalize what was lost in an equal way. Reduction through socio-biological decapitation reduced the Anglo-Saxon capacity for socio-biological self-comprehension. Since they themselves had been reduced to individuals, this reduced their ability to fully put their fingers over the whole of their own predicament. Without a full incorporation of the Norman conquest's influence into modern times, the Anglo-Saxons cannot understand themselves, and an inability to understand this about themselves cripples their ability to understand anyone else.